Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're looking at the all-sufficiency of Christ. We're taking the historical account of John chapter 6 and translating this 2,000-year-old text into highly practical lessons for your daily life. Let's get right to it.
Okay, let's dive into this with a totally relatable analogy from the source material, the junk food craving. You know the drill, right? Imagine a hungry kid whining for a chocolate bar. As a parent, you absolutely know that chocolate is going to give them a quick sugar rush, but what they actually need is a solid, nutritious meal to really sustain them. The sources use this dynamic to explain a core human tendency we see in the text. We so often fixate on temporary, immediate fixes when, in reality, we're starving for something much deeper.
So the text draws a really sharp contrast here between these junk food cravings and real food. In the context of John 6, our human desire for immediate gratification, things like temporary comfort, physical wealth, or, for the crowd back then, political liberation, it's all framed as a lesser substitute. Basically, it's the chocolate bar. The sources explain that sure, it is entirely human to want these earthly things, but prioritizing them puts us at serious risk of missing out on our true, deeper spiritual needs, which the text defines as eternal spiritual sustenance.
To truly grasp how this plays out, we've got to look at the historical context. Jesus and his disciples were completely overwhelmed. They were actively grieving the execution of their friend John the Baptist, plus they were physically exhausted from days of intense, non-stop ministry. So Jesus leads his disciples onto a boat to head across the Sea of Galilee, basically telling them to come away and get some rest. But those plans for a quiet retreat, totally out the window. A massive demanding crowd actually ran 9 miles around the lake just to beat them to the other side. Think about that level of absolute burnout, only to step off the boat and be met with even more demands.
And we are not just talking about a small gathering of eager fans here. The text specifically mentions 5,000 men. Historical commentators point out that when you factor in women and children, we are likely looking at a total crowd of up to 20,000 people. Just try to picture the sheer scale of that for a second. You arrive at your quiet getaway to process your grief, and boom, 20,000 people are waiting for you, demanding your attention. That's enough to fill a major sports arena.
Now, what is truly remarkable here is the response. Rather than getting irritated by this massive inconvenience, which, let's be honest, most of us would, the text notes that Jesus looked at the crowd, saw them as harassed and helpless, and just responded with inexhaustible compassion. He essentially kept an open-door policy. Despite his own severe physical weariness and grief, he welcomed them wholeheartedly. He spent the entire day healing the sick and teaching them right there on the mountainside. It really kind of challenges how we react to our own daily interruptions, doesn't it?
And this brilliantly illustrates a massive practical problem that suddenly arose. As the awe of the teaching fades, reality sets in, and so does the panic. How on earth do you feed 20,000 hungry people in a remote location when you have absolutely zero resources? The crowd had been so eager to follow that they literally forgot to pack food. It is the classic scenario of an overwhelming need clashing with completely inadequate resources. The text presents two very different ways to react to a crisis like this. First up, we have the disciples' logic. Philip immediately crunches the numbers and declares it impossible. The problem is just way too big. Andrew finds a boy with a pitiful packed lunch, just 5 small loaves of bread and 2 tiny fish. But he's quick to point out that this is virtually nothing for a crowd that size. Their logic is completely rooted in defeatism. But then we have this unnamed boy's action. He doesn't overthink it, he just simply hands over what little he has. The actionable lesson here is profound. When faced with overwhelming odds, the text suggests we shouldn't fixate on what we lack. Instead, just offer up whatever meager resources we hold.
Because what happens next is what the sources call a magnificent multiplication. The text states that Jesus took that meager little lunch, gave thanks, and distributed it. And the provision went further than anyone could have ever dreamed. Everyone, all 20,000 people, ate until they were completely stuffed. And the number 12 here is super key. After this massive feast, the disciples collected exactly 12 baskets of leftover food. The sources describe these as baskets of blessings, which proves the provision wasn't just barely enough to scrape by, it was totally inexhaustible and abundant.
But the crowd's reaction to this miraculous provision actually reveals that junk food craving we talked about earlier. Seeing this incredible display of power, they instantly wanted to force Jesus to become their earthly king. They wanted a political deliverer, someone who could sweep the Romans right out of their territory. You see, they were entirely focused on their temporary earthly wants, like national emancipation, and they completely missed their true, deeper spiritual need. Basically, they wanted Jesus for what he could physically do for them, not for who he actually was. So, the crucial point is how the text addresses this massive disconnect. Jesus shifts their focus away from the physical food and the political freedom by declaring himself the bread of life. This definition is absolutely central to the source material. It means he is the ultimate source of spiritual salvation and eternal satisfaction. Unlike physical bread that's just going to leave you hungry again a few hours later, or political victories that are ultimately temporary, the bread of life is presented as the one and only provision that will satisfy the human soul forever. To further demonstrate this all-sufficiency, the narrative pivots right from the mountainside into a terrifying storm on the Sea of Galilee. The disciples are in a boat, rowing furiously against this massive squall, totally exhausted and losing hope. This historical account is used in the sources as a direct metaphor for managing our own daily anxieties. You know, those sudden, overwhelming storms of life where we feel completely alone and totally out of our depth.
Now, what's really interesting about this quote is Jesus' specific response. He approaches their boat by literally walking on the water, a display of absolute authority over the physical world. But when they are terrified, he doesn't just instantly snap his fingers and fix the weather. No, he says, "It is I, do not be afraid." The sources emphasize that this miracle was primarily a divine sign of his constant personal presence. It's this incredible assurance that even in the scariest situations, his presence alone is more than enough to handle the problem.
And the application the sources draw from this is highly, highly practical. Instead of panicking about the storm itself, our goal is to recognize and invite that divine presence right into our difficulties. The text notes that the disciples were initially terrified simply because they didn't recognize him in the storm. But as soon as they realized who it was and were willing to welcome him into their boat by faith, they immediately reached the shore where they were heading.
Let's move to and see how this builds into our final actionable blueprint. We've looked at the compassion in the face of interruption, the magnificent multiplication of meager resources, the definition of the bread of life, and the divine presence in a terrifying storm. The sources distill all of this narrative down into 5 core, practical takeaways that you can use for daily living.
This is a heavily screen-grab-worthy summary of how to apply John 6 today, so pay attention. First, find comfort in his compassion. Know that his care is inexhaustible even when we feel overwhelmed or demanding. Second, be thankful for his provision. Recognize that even the smallest resources are gifts. Third, be confident in his multiplication. When you feel a problem is just way too big, remember that weak and meager offerings can be supernaturally transformed. Fourth, be secure in his salvation. Avoid that junk food craving of temporary fixes and find lasting security in eternal spiritual sustenance. And finally, fifth, be assured of his presence. No matter how dark or scary the storm gets, you are absolutely not alone.
Which brings us to the ultimate question posed by the source material. We have seen how a young boy's simple act of handing over a pitiful packed lunch resulted in a massive banquet with literal baskets of blessings left over. We've seen how welcoming his presence into a battered boat brought immediate safety. So, as you face your own overwhelming needs and limited resources today, will you choose to trust in this all-sufficiency? Will you hand over what you have and just watch what happens? It's a profound challenge to leave you with. Thanks so much for joining us on this explainer, and we'll catch you next time.